In the climate-controlled vault of the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, surrounded by artifacts spanning millennia of human civilization, sits a small clay tablet roughly the size of a smartphone. Its surface bears thousands of wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script pressed into wet clay by a Sumerian scribe's reed stylus approximately 4,400 years ago, around 2400 BCE. The tablet, designated Ni Tuanpu 501, is fragmentary, broken at its edges, missing perhaps two-thirds of its original text. To the untrained eye, it appears unremarkable among the 500,000 similar tablets scattered across museums worldwide. But this particular piece of baked clay contains something extraordinary. Inscribed in one of humanity's earliest writing systems is a story that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of ancient mythology. It tells of Ishkur, the Sumerian storm god, mysteriously imprisoned in the Kur, the dread underworld of shadows and death. With his capture, the world above begins to die. Rivers cease their flow. Crops wither in parched fields. Newborn children are carried off by premature death. The king of the gods, the mighty Enlil himself, convenes a divine assembly and asks which deity will brave the underworld to rescue his captive son. Every god and goddess refuses. The mission is suicide. But then, from the back of the celestial council chamber, an unexpected volunteer steps forward. Not a warrior god, not a powerful deity, but a fox, an animal known for cunning, deception, and guile. This is the earliest known appearance of the trickster fox in world literature, predating similar characters in Greek, Norse, and Asian mythology by millennia. For over 170 years, since its excavation from the ruins of ancient Nippur in the 19th century, this tablet remained largely untranslated, its secrets locked behind the formidable barriers of dead languages, fragmentary preservation, and archaic script. But in 2025, through a combination of scholarly detective work, advanced digital imaging, and cutting-edge artificial intelligence, Dr. Jana Matuzak of the University of Chicago finally cracked the code and revealed the complete story. What she discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient Mesopotamian mythology and reveals that our ancestors, more than 4 millennia ago, understood narrative archetypes that still resonate in every cunning fox character from Aesop's fables to Disney's Robin Hood. How did a small fragment of clay survive for 4,400 years? Why did it take until the 21st century to fully translate it? And what does this ancient story of a clever fox tell us about the dawn of human storytelling? Before we dive into this incredible journey through time, I need you to do something for me. If you're fascinated by ancient history, by the origins of storytelling, by tales of gods and clever animals that somehow feel familiar, despite being older than the pyramids, hit that like button right now. This video took months of research, consulting with Assyriologists and ancient language experts, tracking down academic papers, and piecing together one of the most remarkable archaeological detective stories of the past decade. And here's something amazing. This story we're about to explore isn't speculation. It's not pseudoscience or ancient alien theories. These are the actual words, carefully translated from authentic cuneiform script that a Sumerian scribe pressed into wet clay in the city of Nippur around 2400 BCE. Real mythology, real history, real human creativity from before the Bronze Age collapse, before the pyramids were even finished, when writing itself was only a few hundred years old. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you knew anything about Sumerian mythology before clicking on this video. And subscribe, because we're going deep into one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries of our time. A story that's simultaneously ancient beyond comprehension, and surprisingly, hauntingly familiar. To understand why this discovery matters, we need to travel back in time and place ourselves in the ancient world of Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq. Picture the landscape, not the arid desert we associate with the Middle East today, but a fertile floodplain between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The Greeks would later call this land Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, and for good reason. These rivers gave life to one of humanity's first great civilizations. Around 3500 BCE, something remarkable happened in southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, a people whose origins remain mysterious, developed the world's first true cities. Not villages, not towns, but genuine urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, featuring monumental architecture, specialized labor, social hierarchies, and most importantly, for our story, writing. Cuneiform script, initially developed to track economic transactions like grain shipments and livestock counts, would evolve into a sophisticated system capable of expressing complex narratives, legal codes, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and yes, mythology. By 2400 BCE, when our Fox story was written, Sumerian civilization had been flourishing for over 1,000 years. The city of Nippur, where this tablet was discovered, held special significance. It wasn't the largest city. That honor belonged to places like Ur and Uruk. It wasn't even a major political capital most of the time. But Nippur was something arguably more important. It was the religious center of the Sumerian world, the earthly dwelling place of Enlil, king of the gods. Imagine Nippur at its height. The city sprawls across roughly 135 hectares, about 335 acres, enclosed by massive defensive walls. At its heart rises the Ikur, the mountain house, a towering ziggurat dedicated to Enlil. This wasn't just a temple, it was a statement in brick and bitumen, a man-made mountain reaching toward the heavens, its terraced levels ascending perhaps 20 to 30 meters above the flat Mesopotamian plain. Priests in white linen ascend its staircases, carrying offerings to the god who controlled storms, winds, and the fate of nations. Around the temple complex, the city bustles with life. Scribes sit cross-legged in the shade of reed-mat awnings, their reed styluses poised over clay tablets, recording everything from beer rations to royal decrees. Craftsmen hammer copper, weave linen, throw pottery. Merchants haggle in the marketplaces. Children play in narrow streets between mud brick houses. And in the temple schools, the aduba or tablet house. Young scribes in training practice their cuneiform signs, copying ancient texts again and again until the wedge shapes flow naturally from their styluses. It's in one of these contexts, perhaps a temple library, perhaps a scribal school, perhaps even a private home, that our tablet was created. A scribe, thoroughly trained in the complex Sumerian writing system, takes a lump of clay about the size of a modern tablet computer. He kneads it smooth, shapes it into a rectangular form, and begins to write. His reed stylus, cut at an angle, presses into the soft clay, creating the distinctive wedge-shaped marks that give cuneiform its name. From the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Each sign might represent a sound, a word, or an entire concept, depending on context. Reading cuneiform isn't just decoding, it's interpretation. The scribe is copying a story, perhaps from an older tablet, perhaps from oral tradition being committed to permanent form. He knows this story well. It's part of his cultural heritage, taught alongside other myths of gods and heroes. With practiced efficiency, he fills the tablet with lines of text, creating a permanent record that, unknowingly, will survive longer than his civilization, his language, and every building in the city around him. When finished, the tablet is either left to dry in the sun or, more likely, baked in a kiln. This firing is what saves it. Unbaked tablets can return to mud in rain or flood. But once fired, clay tablets become nearly indestructible. They can survive house fires, city destructions, millennia buried in sand. They're more durable than paper, more permanent than parchment, more resilient than any digital storage system we've yet invented. Ironically, humanity's oldest writing medium is still its most permanent. But who were these gods whose stories the Sumerians recorded? The Sumerian pantheon was vast and complex, reflecting a sophisticated theological system that influenced all subsequent Mesopotamian religions, including those of the Babylonians and Assyrians. At the top sat An, the sky god, supreme but distant. Below him was Enlil, god of air, wind, and storms, the active executive of the divine realm, the one who actually ran things. Then came Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, the clever engineer of the cosmos. And there was Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the complex goddess of love, war, and everything in between. Ishkur, the storm god at the center of our story, was Enlil's son. He controlled the thunderstorms that brought life-giving rain, but also devastating floods. In the agricultural society of ancient Mesopotamia, Ishkur was literally a god of life and death. Too little rain meant famine. Too much meant destruction. His capture by the underworld wasn't just a divine soap opera. It represented cosmic catastrophe, the failure of the natural order itself. The Kur, the underworld where Ishkur is imprisoned, was the Sumerian land of the dead. Unlike later concepts of hell with punishment and torture, the Kur was simply a shadowy, gloomy place beneath the earth where all humans eventually went. It was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, Inanna's dark sister, and was a place from which no one returned. Even gods feared it. The very idea that Ishkur could be trapped there was terrifying. If a god could be imprisoned in death's realm, what hope did mortals have? Now, fast forward to 1851. The ancient cities of Mesopotamia lie buried under centuries of sand and silt, their names preserved only in biblical texts and classical references. Western scholars know Babylon and Assyria from the Bible, but Sumer, the earlier foundational civilization, has been entirely forgotten. The Sumerian language itself is unknown. Cuneiform, once used for 3 millennia across the ancient Near East, has been unreadable for 16 centuries. This is when Austen Henry Layard, the pioneering British archaeologist, begins excavating at Nippur. Well, actually, that's not quite right. Layard worked primarily at Nineveh and other Assyrian sites. The American excavations at Nippur began later, in 1888, led by John Punnett Peters of the University of Pennsylvania. These weren't the careful, stratigraphic excavations of modern archaeology. This was 19th century archaeology. Dig fast, find treasures, ship everything back to museums. The methods were crude by today's standards, but the results were revolutionary. From 1888 to 1900, and in subsequent expeditions throughout the 20th century, archaeologists pulled tens of thousands of tablets from the ruins of Nippur. Tens of thousands. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Libraries, archives, schools. Nippur had been a center of learning, and its ruins yielded an embarrassment of textual riches. Tablets were cataloged, photographed, and distributed to museums and universities around the world. Many went to Istanbul, others to Philadelphia, still more to other institutions. And here's where we encounter the first major challenge. reading them. Deciphering cuneiform was one of the 19th century's great intellectual achievements. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks worked for decades to crack the code, using multilingual inscriptions like the Behistun inscription as their Rosetta Stone. By the 1850s, they could read Akkadian cuneiform reasonably well. Akkadian was a Semitic language, distantly related to Hebrew and Arabic, and once scholars understood the underlying linguistic structure, progress came quickly. But Sumerian was different. Sumerian isn't related to any known language family. It's a linguistic isolate, meaning it has no known relatives. While Akkadian scribes wrote in a Semitic language using cuneiform, they were using a writing system originally designed for an entirely different language with different grammar, different word structure, different everything. Imagine trying to write English using Chinese characters, and you'll get a sense of the complications involved. Moreover, by the time Sumerian tablets were being excavated in the 19th century, the language had been dead for over 2,000 years. The last people who spoke Sumerian as a native language died around 2000 BCE. After that, it survived only as a scholarly and religious language, like Latin in medieval Europe. Scribes learned it in school, priests used it in rituals, but nobody's children played in Sumerian. This meant that while later Akkadian scribes left us dictionaries and teaching texts comparing Sumerian to Akkadian, we lack the kind of living language intuition that makes translation natural and fluid. Decoding Sumerian has been a multi-generational project involving hundreds of scholars. By the early 20th century, researchers could read the language reasonably well, good enough to translate royal inscriptions, administrative records, and clearer literary texts. But many tablets remained problematic. Some were too fragmentary. Others contained rare vocabulary or unusual grammatical constructions. Still others, like our Fox tablet, combined multiple challenges: fragmentary preservation, archaic vocabulary, and narrative contexts that weren't immediately clear. So tablet Ni 120501 sat. It was catalogued. It was photographed. Some preliminary work was done, enough to identify it as mythological in nature, enough to note the unusual appearance of a fox. But a complete, confident translation? That remained elusive. Scholars had bigger fish to fry, more complete tablets, clearer texts, major literary works that could be fully reconstructed. A fragmentary animal fable, however interesting, had to wait. Decades passed. The 20th century brought enormous advances in Sumerian studies. Scholars developed better dictionaries, more sophisticated grammatical understanding, and comprehensive concordances showing how words were used across different texts. Museums and universities began digitizing their tablet collections, creating searchable databases. What once required physically traveling to multiple institutions and squinting at tiny clay impressions under inadequate lighting could now be done on a computer screen. With high-resolution photographs, sometimes even 3D scans. But tablet Ni 120501 remained stubbornly opaque. The fragmentary nature meant that key words were missing. The narrative context was unclear. And crucially, this was apparently a unique composition. No duplicate copies existed that could be used to fill in the gaps. With many Sumerian literary texts, scholars have found multiple copies from different time periods and locations, allowing them to reconstruct the complete text by combining different fragments like a jigsaw puzzle. But the fox story appeared on only this one tablet. Whatever clues might have existed elsewhere had been lost to time. Enter Dr. Jana Matuzak. In 2025, Matuzak, a researcher at the University of Chicago with expertise in Sumerian language and mythology, decided to take another look at Ni 12501. She brought to the project not just linguistic expertise, but also modern digital tools that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations of Assyriologists. High-resolution digital imaging revealed cuneiform impressions that were barely visible to the naked eye. Reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, used photographs taken from multiple angles to create interactive images where the lighting could be adjusted digitally, making even the shallowest impressions readable. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: artificial intelligence. Metuzak employed machine learning algorithms specifically trained on cuneiform texts. These weren't general-purpose AI systems, but specialized tools that had been taught on thousands of cuneiform tablets, learning to recognize the patterns of Sumerian grammar, the common collocations of words, and the probable readings of damaged or unclear signs. Think about how this works. When you're reading English and encounter a smudged word, let's say you see the cat ST on the mat, your brain automatically fills in the missing letter as A to make SAT because you understand English grammar and context. You know cat is the subject, you recognize this as a sentence about a cat's position, and you know that sat on the mat is a common phrase. Your brain processes all this instantly and unconsciously. The AI does something similar, but with Sumerian cuneiform. It's been trained on enough texts to understand what kinds of words typically appear in mythological narratives, what grammatical forms are most likely in given contexts, and what sequences of wedge marks probably represent. When confronted with a damaged sign on the tablet, it can suggest probable readings based on context, grammar, and the partial marks that remain visible. It doesn't just guess randomly. It's making informed predictions based on patterns learned from thousands of other texts. But here's what's crucial. The AI doesn't replace the human scholar. Metuzak wasn't simply accepting whatever the algorithm suggested. She was using AI as a tool, one more source of hypotheses to test against her own linguistic knowledge, her understanding of Sumerian mythology, and her careful examination of the physical tablet. Where the AI suggested a reading, she verified it against the actual clay impressions. Where the AI was uncertain, she used her expertise to make judgment calls. The result was a collaboration between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, each compensating for the other's limitations. The process was painstaking. Each line of text might take hours to finalize. Uncertain readings required checking dozens of parallel texts to see how similar words were used elsewhere. Grammatical forms had to be verified against Sumerian linguistic theory. And the narrative had to make sense, not just grammatically, but mythologically. Did these actions fit what we know about Sumerian religious thought? Were the gods behaving consistently with their characters in other texts? Did the story follow recognizable narrative patterns? Gradually, over months of work, the text revealed itself. And what a text it was. Here, preserved in fragmentary form on a 400-year-old clay tablet, was the earliest known trickster fox story in world literature. The narrative was sophisticated, dramatically structured, and surprisingly complete despite the missing portions. Enough survived to reconstruct the basic plot and appreciate the storytelling craft. The story begins with disaster. Ishkur, the mighty storm god, has somehow been captured and imprisoned in the Kur, the underworld. The text doesn't explain how this happened. That portion is lost, broken off the tablet's edge. But we're thrown immediately into crisis. With Ishkur trapped below, the cosmic order has broken down. The text describes the consequences in vivid detail. The good waters cease to flow. The fertile fields produce no crops. And most heartbreaking, newborns are carried off before their time. Premature death has been loosed upon the world. Enlil, father of Ishkur and king of the gods, convenes the divine assembly. In Sumerian theology, major decisions were made collectively by the council of gods, much like human city assemblies made civic decisions. The gods gather. We can imagine the scene, a celestial throne room filled with divine beings, each representing some aspect of the natural or social order. The mood is somber. The problem is clear. Ishkur must be rescued. But who will go? The Kur is not just dangerous, it's death itself. In other Sumerian myths, we learn what happens when gods venture into the underworld. In the descent of Inanna, the goddess of love and war travels to the Kur and is killed. Her corpse hung on a hook, only being rescued through Enki's clever intervention. Even powerful deities fear the land of no return. The underworld is ruled by Ereshkigal and guarded by her fearsome gatekeeper, Neti. 7 gates bar entry, and at each gate, travelers must surrender part of their divine power. By the time you reach the throne room, you're vulnerable, stripped of protection. Small wonder the gods hesitate. Enlil asks for a volunteer. The text describes this moment with dramatic power. He's asking which deity will dare to be the hero. And the response? Silence. One by one, the gods refuse. Each has reasons, no doubt. Legitimate fears of the underworld's dangers. This isn't cowardice exactly. It's rational caution. Nobody wants to share Ishkur's fate. Then comes the story's most surprising moment. A fox. Just a fox, an animal, not even a minor deity, steps forward and volunteers. In the fragmentary text, we can almost sense the shock. This small creature, this humble animal known for raiding chicken coops and scavenging at the edges of farmland, has the audacity to volunteer for a mission every god has refused? But remember what foxes represent in mythology worldwide. They're tricksters, clever, cunning, able to solve problems through guile rather than strength. In Japanese folklore, kitsune are magical foxes with intelligence and mystical powers. In European fables, Reynard the fox outwits stronger animals through clever scheming. In Native American traditions, Coyote, a close cousin to the fox, is the archetypal trickster who remakes the world through craftiness. And here, in this Sumerian text from 2400 BCE, we find perhaps the earliest literary appearance of this archetype. The fox's plan, insofar as we can reconstruct it from the damaged text, involves not force, but cunning. Exactly what trick the fox employs isn't entirely clear from the surviving portions, but the outcome is. Somehow, through cleverness rather than might, the fox succeeds where gods feared to try. Ishkur is freed. The storm god returns to the upper world. The cosmic order is restored. Waters flow again. Fields become fertile. Children live past their births. The significance of this reversal cannot be overstated. A small, weak animal succeeds where mighty gods failed, not through power, but through intelligence and courage. It's a narrative pattern that will echo through millennia of storytelling. David defeats Goliath. The tortoise beats the hare. The young shepherd boy becomes king. The overlooked hero saves the day. Every underdog story in human literature descends, in some way, from this basic pattern. And here it is, fully formed, in one of the oldest stories ever written. But the discovery raises profound questions about how translation works and what we risk losing when ancient texts remain unread. Consider this. For over 170 years, this tablet existed in museums, catalogued and preserved, but not truly understood. The story was there. The words were there, pressed into clay by a scribe who wanted it remembered. but without someone who could read it, who possessed the linguistic tools and cultural context to unlock its meaning. It might as well have been blank clay. This is the translation challenge that confronts every dead language, every ancient text. It's not like translating modern French to English, where both languages are living, where you can check your work against native speakers, where ambiguities can be resolved by asking, what was a French person mean by this? With Sumerian, there are no native speakers to consult. There are no living communities whose cultural practices illuminate the text. There's only the archaeological record, comparative linguistics, and painstaking scholarship across generations. Every cuneiform sign poses potential difficulties. Cuneiform is what linguists call a logosyllabic script, meaning a single wedge-shaped sign might represent a whole word, or a syllable, or even a concept, depending on context. The sign might have multiple readings, and only grammatical context and scholarly judgment determine which is correct. Imagine if the letters read could mean both present tense, I read books, and past tense, I read that book yesterday. And you had to figure out which from context alone. That's cuneiform every single sentence. Moreover, Sumerian grammar is complex and utterly unlike Indo-European languages. It's agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning by stringing together morphemes, small units of meaning, into long compound words. Verb forms can encode subject, object, tense, mood, and more in a single complex word. The word order is different from English. The conceptual categories are different. You can't just swap Sumerian words for English words and call it translation. You have to reconstruct the entire thought pattern. And then there's cultural context. When the text mentions the Kur, the underworld, what exactly does that mean? What did Sumerians believe about the afterlife? When Enlil convenes the divine assembly, what's the protocol? What's the hierarchy? When the fox volunteers, is this seen as brave or foolish or cunning? These aren't just questions of vocabulary. They're questions of reconstructing an entire worldview from fragmentary evidence. This is where Matuzak's expertise proved essential. She brought to the project not just linguistic skill, but deep knowledge of Sumerian mythology, culture, and literary conventions. When the AI suggested possible readings, she could evaluate them against what made sense in Sumerian theological context. When multiple interpretations were grammatically possible, she could choose based on narrative logic and mythological parallels. The AI provided possibilities. The human scholar provided judgment. The result is what we might call a reconstructed translation. Not a word-for-word rendition, which would be unreadable, but a scholarly interpretation that attempts to convey both the literal meaning and the narrative impact of the original. It's translation as art and science combined, requiring both technical precision and literary sensitivity. Think about what was required to achieve this translation. First, 19th century archaeologists had to excavate Nippur, recognizing the importance of seemingly mundane clay tablets and preserving them for future study. Then, generations of Assyriologists had to painstakingly decode cuneiform and reconstruct Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. Museum professionals had to catalog, preserve, and eventually digitize the tablet, making it accessible to scholars worldwide. Computer scientists had to develop imaging technologies and AI algorithms sophisticated enough to analyze ancient writing. And finally, a dedicated scholar had to bring all these tools together, spending months on a single fragmentary text because she recognized its potential importance. It's a reminder that knowledge is cumulative, that each generation builds on the work of those before. The scholars who first cataloged Ni 12501 in the 19th century couldn't fully translate it, but they preserved it for those who could. The Assyriologists who developed Sumerian dictionaries in the mid-20th century didn't live to see this translation, but their work made it possible. The museum staff who digitized the tablet didn't know it would enable an AI-assisted breakthrough, but their efforts proved crucial. Every step mattered. And now, finally, after 4,400 years, we can read the story the Sumerian scribe wanted to tell. But why did they tell it? What purpose did this story serve in ancient Mesopotamian society? This isn't just an academic question. It gets at the very heart of why humans tell stories at all. On the most obvious level, the tale entertains. It has drama, conflict, an underdog hero, and a satisfying resolution. Sumerians, like all humans, enjoyed a good story. Evidence from ancient Mesopotamia shows that myths and tales were performed at festivals, recited in schools, and probably told around evening fires. Entertainment value mattered. But the story also educates, encoding cultural values and wisdom. The fox succeeds through cleverness, through intelligence and cunning, rather than brute force. In a civilization that valued literacy, learning, and administrative skill, this would resonate. The scribes who preserved these stories were themselves examples of intelligence triumphing over circumstance. They held power not through noble birth or physical prowess, but through their mastery of writing and calculation. A story about a clever animal outwitting stronger beings would naturally appeal to a scribal class. There's also theological significance. The story demonstrates that even the mighty gods can face crises requiring unexpected solutions. Divine power has limits. Sometimes the unlikeliest source provides salvation. This reflects a sophisticated theological worldview that saw gods as powerful but not omnipotent, subject to cosmic laws and capable of needing help. It's quite different from later monotheistic conceptions of divine omnipotence. Moreover, the story addresses a real problem ancient Mesopotamians faced: drought. When rains failed, when the storm god seemed absent or imprisoned by hostile forces, what could humans do? The myth provided a narrative framework for understanding catastrophe. It wasn't random misfortune. It was cosmic struggle. And it could be resolved, not necessarily through power, but through cleverness and courage. There's psychological comfort in that framework. Looking at the broader context of world mythology, the fox story fits into patterns we see across cultures. The trickster figure, whether fox, coyote, rabbit, spider, or raven, appears in mythologies worldwide. These characters share common traits. They're often small or weak by conventional measures, but they succeed through cunning, flexibility, and willingness to break rules. They're transformative figures, solving problems through unconventional means, sometimes even creating or reshaping the world itself. Why do trickster stories appear so universally? Perhaps because they speak to a deep human experience, the feeling of being small and powerless in a vast, threatening world, yet finding ways to survive and even triumph through intelligence and adaptability. Every human society has known what it's like to face overwhelming challenges: natural disasters, stronger enemies, famine, disease. And every society has also known that sometimes the clever solution succeeds where direct confrontation fails. The Sumerian fox story is among the earliest examples of this pattern being formalized in literature. But it clearly builds on even older oral traditions. Stories don't emerge fully formed from nothing. They evolve, crystallizing from repeated tellings, shaped by countless storytellers refining what works. By the time the scribe pressed this story into clay in 2400 BCE, it was probably already ancient, a traditional tale being recorded for preservation. What else might this tablet tell us? One fascinating aspect is what it reveals about literary composition in early Mesopotamia. The story, even in its fragmentary state, shows sophisticated narrative structure. It has a clear beginning, crisis, middle, attempted solutions failing, then unexpected hero succeeding, and end, resolution. It uses repetition and contrast for effect. It creates dramatic tension through the refusal of the gods, followed by the surprising volunteer. These are craft techniques that modern screenwriters would recognize. This suggests that by 2400 BCE, Sumerian storytellers had already developed sophisticated narrative conventions. They understood pacing, character, dramatic irony, and thematic resonance. Writing was still relatively new, only about a millennium old. But literary artistry was already highly developed. Makes you wonder what stories existed in the preceding millennia of purely oral tradition. Stories that left no permanent record, but surely exhibited equal sophistication. The tablet also provides linguistic evidence about early dynastic Sumerian, the form of the language used around 2400 BCE. Every text helps scholars refine their understanding of how the language worked, what vocabulary was used when, and how grammatical structures evolved over time. Even small details, like particular verb forms or unusual word choices, contribute to the larger project of reconstructing this dead language. And there's the simple fact of cultural continuity. This story about a fox was important enough to someone 4,400 years ago that they took the time to carefully write it in a labor-intensive writing system on clay that had to be shaped, inscribed, and fired. They valued it. They wanted it preserved. And across a gulf of more than 4 millennia, through the collapse of civilizations, the death of languages, and the transformation of the entire world, their efforts succeeded. We can read their story. We can appreciate their creativity. We can recognize the fundamental humanity in their tale of the clever underdog who saves the day. There's something profoundly moving about that connection across time. The scribe who wrote this tablet probably never imagined it would be read 4,400 years later. They probably assumed their language and civilization would continue forever. How could they imagine otherwise? Yet even as they wrote, their world was mortal. Within a few centuries, Sumerian would cease being anyone's native language. Within a millennium, their cities would be ruins. Within 2 millennia, even the memory of Sumer would fade, preserved only in later Babylonian and Assyrian references. But their story survived. Against all odds, one small tablet made it through. And now, through a combination of archaeological preservation, scholarly dedication, and modern technology, we can once again read about the fox who volunteered when all the gods refused, who ventured into the underworld and brought the storm god home. The story also raises intriguing questions about cultural transmission. We know that later Mesopotamian cultures, Babylonians, Assyrians, inherited and adapted Sumerian mythology. The gods remained, though often with Akkadian names replacing Sumerian ones. Stories were retold, recopied, and reinterpreted across centuries. Did this fox story circulate beyond this single tablet? Did later versions exist that haven't survived? Did the motif of the clever fox influence later trickster tales in Mesopotamian literature? And what about transmission beyond Mesopotamia? Could this story, or stories like it, have influenced the development of trickster traditions in other cultures? Ancient Mesopotamia had extensive trade networks. Ideas, stories, and myths traveled along trade routes just as goods did. Could echoes of the Sumerian fox have reached Egypt, Anatolia, the Indus Valley, perhaps even further? Or did similar stories develop independently, emerging from similar human experiences and psychological needs? We can't know for certain. Cultural transmission in the ancient world is notoriously difficult to trace. But it's tantalizing to consider that the fox stories found in Aesop's fables, composed around 600 BCE in Greece, might have distant ancestors in earlier Near Eastern traditions. Aesop's Greece had contact with the Persian Empire, which had conquered Mesopotamia, which preserved Sumerian literary traditions in translation. The channels existed for cultural transmission, even if we can't prove specific instances. What we can say with certainty is that this newly translated story demonstrates the remarkable sophistication of early human storytelling. These weren't primitive people crudely grunting around fires. They were artists and thinkers who understood narrative structure, character development, dramatic tension, and thematic resonance. They created stories that still work, that still engage, that still resonate with fundamental human experiences. The AI-assisted translation also opens new possibilities for Assyriology. Thousands of cuneiform tablets remain only partially translated or entirely untranslated. Many languish in museum storage, cataloged but not studied in detail. The volume of material exceeds the capacity of human scholars working with traditional methods. But machine learning tools, used responsibly under expert supervision, could accelerate the process dramatically. Imagine what else might be discovered. More literary texts revealing ancient storytelling traditions. Administrative records illuminating daily life, legal documents showing how justice worked. Scientific texts demonstrating ancient knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, medicine. Letters providing intimate glimpses into personal relationships across millennia. All this knowledge exists, pressed into clay, waiting for someone with the right tools and dedication to unlock it. Of course, AI isn't a magic solution. These algorithms have limitations. They work best with clear, well-preserved texts in well-documented contexts. Fragmentary, unusual, or highly specialized texts still require extensive human expertise. The AI is a tool, not a replacement for trained scholars. But as a tool, it's transformative, enabling work that would be practically impossible otherwise. The discovery also highlights the importance of funding humanities research and maintaining museum collections. Without the initial archaeological expeditions to Nippur, this tablet wouldn't exist in modern collections. Without museum staff preserving and cataloging it, it would have been lost. Without digitization projects making collections accessible online, Matusek might never have examined it closely. Without research funding allowing scholars to pursue specialized projects, the translation might never have happened. Every step of the chain matters. And it reminds us that the past isn't finished. We're not done discovering history. Every year brings new archaeological finds, new translations of ancient texts, new interpretations of existing evidence.